All right. If you've been watching my recent videos, you've seen several focused on, shall we say, sizable Marshall knives. So you know that I've been diving into arts like Argentine Esgrima Criolla. And I highly recommend Jorge Prena's book on this subject. And I'll put the link in the description below. And in that book, he describes a traditional weapon, and here I go butchering the pronunciation, called a caronero, which is described as kind of a short sword, often cut down from a longer blade, usually with a straightish and often double-edged blade. But the blades are around, as he describes, 40 centimeters, about 16 inches long, single-handed, with minimal to no guard. And the reason for that, as the name implies, is so it can be carried slipped between the layers of your saddle blankets. Now, when you think about it, there's certainly a lot of weapons in a lot of other cultures and systems that sort of match those specifications. So yes, this is probably just an excuse for Mike to take something off his wish list. But 40 centimeter blade, single-handed, minimal guard, kind of describes, well, spoiler alert in the title, the Apoc survival Yatagan. So let's take a look at it. Up first, out of the box edge, and yes, we are going to do a couple of harder tests on it. A little toothy, a little rippy. How about a little bit of cardboard before we get into heavier stuff? Now, this is that smooth black oxide finish, so I don't expect any real binding. And I didn't get any, so pretty good. So the Apoc Survival Yatagan has a lot in common with other Apoc tactical swords, and that includes the design of the Scabbard, which is a plastic tube with a mottled finish, and yes, it has a drainage hole on the end in case you're taking it out in the rain, with a removable bracket for different kinds of mounting options, and this one came with the nice added touch of some paracord. Now, the lockup on all of these is the same, at least in terms of their swords versus their knives. You've got two indentations, one on either side of the feed lips, that interface with similar round divots at the top of the G10 scales. And depending on fit and finish, I've found that that can be sloppy and loose, or so tight that you need a crowbar to get the thing out of the scabbard. This one, however, is Goldilocks just right. Positive lockup, but easy enough to thumb break without a struggle. Now, the other thing to consider is, yeah, even though this is a hollow tube, you're not hearing any rattle. And part of that, at least, is on their newer scabbards. See if I can get it in the light. There's an insert, rectangular in shape, to fit the blade, and it only goes in a couple of inches, but that does go a long way to actually making the fit and finish of the scabbard pretty impressive. Now, I have had one issue. When I unsheath it, I occasionally cause myself some pain, and it doesn't have anything to do with the scabbard. It has to do with the fit and finish of the sword itself. So let's get into it. If you've seen any of my other reviews of Apoc tactical swords and knives, you know a couple of things. One, I do seem to keep going back to them. And that's because, two, I find that I consistently get excellent materials and very interesting design geometry for very little money. But I also tend to encounter the same kinds of fit and finish issues, but they're all usually things I can easily fix to turn a good tool into an awesome tool. And while I'm at it, it really opens up the possibilities for what you could do with customizing. And with this one, well, it's got some of those issues, but surprisingly not as much as expected. But let's talk about the specs, and I'm going to be looking down at my notes so I can give you the metric as well as the imperial, starting with the blade length. Now I consider the full blade length to be 17 inches, but the cutting edge is 16, so 40 centimeters. Blade is 1.5 inches wide, about 4 centimeters thick at the base, with a little bit of taper down towards the tip belly, and yes, it is recurved forward, which is traditional for the Yatagan. We'll talk about how that performs in cutting, chopping, and handling. Now, yeah, the secondary edge bevel is a little bit steep and could use some improvement. 5 millimeters thick at the base of the blade, and that goes through the full tang with a bit of an accelerating distal taper down towards that tip, which gives you a blade that's not really flexible to speak of, but yeah, 90-60 spring steel. And if it's been hardened properly, so far like my other Apoc products have, I expect it will be able to take a lot of hard use. And same with this oxide finish, which in this case is kind of like bluing. It's held up really well on the other models, but yeah, we're going to check. Now, according to my test files, and I don't have a lot of bare steel to work with yet because I haven't exposed any in customizing, from what I can access, they're testing between 50 and 55 HRC, which is consistent across my other Apoc swords. So certainly a functional hardness. All right, overall length, 23.5 inches. Now grip length, if I'm measuring from, this cut at the base of the front down to the hook of the front of the grip, that gives me 4 inches of usable grip, so about 10 centimeters. All right, let's talk about that fit and finish. You've got flat ground, blade planes. They're pretty well done, actually. There's a little tiny bit of rippling you might be able to see. But one of the things that I tend to expect with Apoc products is when they cut this slab of spring steel out, they might leave some unfinished edges that are sharp and even ragged. In this case, not so much. That spine has been finished. It's flat. It's a tiny bit of rippling in it, but it's nice and smooth and crisp. And that continues through the tang. No seams, no gaps, no shelves, no hot spots. Very clean. Not going to have to do anything to that, except for one spot. All right, I mentioned there was a little bit of pain when I unsheathed it. That was because my finger keeps colliding with this ledge. That ledge is really sharp. I expect that if I'm touching that under any kind of impact, I'm going to regret it. So I'm probably going to have to clean that up, but not much else. Like other Apoc products, nice stout G10 scales that are secured like they're swords with 3 beefy screws. And when I take it apart, I expect I'm going to see a full tang with no cutouts. And I'll show you a picture when I do. Now, like some of my other Apoc swords, as compared to the grips that come on their knives, yeah, you can already see those are really square and blocky. But they're not sharp. But yeah, in my hand that feels like a board, not a sword. However, G10 is really easy to work with files and sandpaper and such, and I found that a little bit of rounding on this grip geometry turns board into awesome. But I'm going to go ahead and test it before I do that. Speaking of feel, all right, overall weight, 1 pound 14 ounces, about 850 grams. Point of balance, if measured from that notch that stops my hand, it's about 2.5 inches north of that. So yeah, weight into the blade, giving it blade presence, but not making it at all unwieldy, except, yeah, that board-shaped grip. All right, before I make any changes, let's take it out, run a couple of tests, see how it can chop and handle impact. All right, my old friend Scabbard. Multiple layers of thick cardboard over several inches thick of compressed brown paper bag over wood. Something I can thrust into, basically get a good sense of not only penetration, but yeah, kickback. So not a whole lot of point in stabbing. Reverse with that. Okay, there's a sense of what the future is about to be. But thrusting. having trouble finding the tip with that curve, but once ow, okay. All right, really got to do something about that. Okay, we're back post-testing. First thing I did was thrust into my L. And that was not a good idea, and I knew it, but I did it anyway, and well, I got what I expected, which is my hand ramming into those sharp edges pretty much every time. I had to choke way down and hang on tight to keep that from happening, but with the taper of the grip, yeah, it just slid right into that. So that's probably the first thing I need to do. Took it out to chop into some hard bamboo, and that test is not so much about what this will do to the bamboo, but what the bamboo will do to this, especially since I'm intentionally hitting it at some bad angles. For me, it's a test of a potentially fragile edge. Can I chip or roll the edge? And I hate to say it, but it's barely detectable. But yeah, I feel like there's just a little bit of extra raggedness on the edge now. So the edge does need to be improved. The bigger part of that test is to see how the weapon handles impact, how the build holds together, well, pretty solidly, how it transfers impact back into my hand. I don't know how much of it is the curvature that I'm not used to and how much of it is the square grip. I was having a hard time keeping a hold of it. I wound up doing a lot of my chopping here inside the curve versus up here because, you know, the blade sort of wraps around what it's hitting. If you hit it down here, allowed me to keep alignment better than hitting it up here. So I think the shape of the grip was definitely working against me. Took it to chopping some boards. It did okay, not as well as expected, but again, a lot of that test is, okay, how does it hold up and how does it transfer impact back? Not comfortable whatsoever. And I did have some trouble, depending on where I hit that wood, keeping my edge alignment, keeping it from twisting. Did a little batoning, did just fine, even when I hit a knot in the log. And as you can see, after just wiping it down, not a mark on the finish. And I do tend to come to expect that from Apoc finishes. They are very, very resilient. So now what I'm going to do is, before we talk any further about handling, I'm going to do something about that sharp corner and reshape these grips. So to be continued. All right, how'd surgery go? Well, I'll put up some pictures. I did some significant rounding to the grip scales, and while I was at it, I actually rounded this top corner to allow myself to hook my thumb comfortably over the top of it to choke up. And speaking of choking up, I did round those sharp corners there and then rounded the edges of, I didn't make a finger choil, just more like a ricasso, if I want to choke up on the blade to use it for closer work. I repeated the stabbing tests, the striking tests, the chopping tests, and yeah, it's a whole lot more comfortable. And when I tried to use it to carve and shave, yeah, being able to choke up on it like this, big help. So definitely made it a more useful field tool. But let's talk about it martially. Martially speaking, let's start with, is this a Yatagan? If we're talking about the traditional weapon of the Ottoman Turk from about the 16th to the 19th century, I'm going to say they mostly got it right. Now, there are some historic examples that are significantly longer employed as cavalry sabers. But there was a version about this long issued to foot soldiers as a backup sidearm and also utility tool. And it was this big to make it easy to carry, so they got that right. Single edge, no back edge, got that right. Distinctive gentle forward sweep, got that right. But certain historic examples you might see a little bit more pronounced recurve sweep to that blade. And I feel like that would go a long way to helping the cutting mechanics of this particular implement. I can also see why Apoc probably didn't do it to keep the costs down. I mean, I paid less than $120 for this thing at Chicago Knife Works. I'll put the link in the description below, but something I might consider trying to do to this one because, all right, some of this may just be my lack of experience with this particular tool. Only been using it for a couple of days, but I'm still struggling with any confidence cutting here. A lot more confident doing my heavy cutting down here on the inside of the belly, which makes sense, but it reduces my reach. Also, speaking of just me, I'm still having trouble with the accuracy of my thrusts. I'm consistently missing by about that much. But again, that might be the feel of the blade, or it's probably just me. However, having some thoughts on what I might do to blade profile. I also feel like maybe a few more inches would do it very well, but can't make it longer. Let's go down to this end. No hand protection, no guard, that's traditional. This forward hook on the grip, bottom of the grip, the pommel, that is traditional. Okay, surviving examples, well, the first thing you're going to notice is they do tend to be really ornate. And here we are going with basic black tactical. That makes sense. But one thing the Yatagan is notorious for is many examples having really wide flared ears on either side of this pommel. And I can see how that would function to increase retention in your grip, especially if you're talking about a cavalry weapon or something used in the chaos of combat. You can also see where that might get in the way of easy carry, and a weapon at this price point just might not have been able to do it. So yeah, not there, but I think that's okay. But where does this fit into a martial artist's repertoire? Well, it's a short sword. A blade length is about the same length for me as a wakizashi, so I could use it like that, even though it's curved in a different direction. Speaking of wakizashi, could I put it in my offhand and pair it with a longer blade, companion sword? Yeah, absolutely it would function that way. Speaking of which, no hand protection, could I pair it with something else that might cover my hand like a small shield? Yeah, that would work too. Or in Eskrima Criolla, we could be talking about a poncho. But otherwise, yeah, arts where this would function well if you need a short sword or want to practice movements that were designed for a longer sword in closer quarters. That would work too. The adjustments I've made so far make it really comfortable to move around, to cut, to slash. If I could find the tip, I could thrust with it just fine. And yes, it has enough authority and length that I would feel comfortable parrying with it. Kind of watch the fact that I have no hand protection, but I think that forward sweep would help me control an opponent's weapon. So that could work in my favor, and I could get around corners in interesting ways like you can with a curved saber, just kind of backwards. So it's got a lot of potential. And speaking of the curve and potential, one of the first possibilities that struck me when I saw this, and then again picking it up and handling it, immediately thought about Filipino eskrima. So Apoc, if you're paying attention, maybe add a couple more inches onto the blade. But let's lean into that forward curve, okay, and change the tip geometry to point it forward instead of sweeping it back. and you would have a gununting, which would also allow you to do those beak strikes, right? I immediately thought of how a practitioner of eskrima could put this to good use, both by itself and paired with something else. That could be a perfect potential use for it, especially for the money. This is, again, I paid less than $120 for this, so for that I'm getting a pretty sturdy, handy blade, well, after I made a couple of changes for my own comfort. And I may not be done yet. Again, I might, well, tune up the grip a little bit more. But yeah, I'm thinking about what I might do to the profile of the blade. And if I do that, there will be a to be continued. But until then, if you have this or any questions about it, or you want to talk about any other Apoc products or similar blades, let's get our conversation going as always in the comments. Otherwise, as always, thank you so much for watching, following my journey, subscribing to the channel, liking the videos, and I do hope to see you back for whatever I get myself into next.